The year was 1923. The world was changing very fast in the big cities, but in the small farming town of Green River, things stayed mostly the same. Green River was a quiet place, surrounded by endless fields of wheat and corn. The people who lived there worked hard from the moment the sun came up until it went down again. They knew the land, they knew the weather, and most importantly, they knew each other. There were no strangers in Green River. If a man got sick, his neighbours came over to milk his cows. If a barn burned down, the whole town gathered to build a new one. It was a simple life, filled with dirt roads, wooden houses, and the slow passage of the seasons. The town had a main street with a general store, a bakery, a doctor's office, and a small brick building at the end of the road. This small brick building was the telephone exchange. The telephone was still a very new thing for the people of Green River. A few years ago, tall wooden poles had been put up along the main roads, carrying long copper wires from house to house. At first, the older farmers did not trust the new invention. They thought it was strange to talk to someone who was not standing right in front of them. But slowly the town got used to it. The doctor could be called quickly if a child fell ill in the middle of the night. The store owner could order flour and sugar without having to take a train to the city. The telephone brought the town closer together, connecting their voices through the wires. To make all of this work, the town needed a central operator. They needed someone to sit in the brick building, answer the calls, and connect the wires. That person was Alice Walker. Alice was 22 years old. She had lived in Green River her entire life. She was a quiet, careful girl who liked things to be neat and organized. She lived with her parents in a white house just a short walk from the centre of town. Her father was a farmer who spent his days out in the fields, and her mother stayed home, cooking and mending clothes. Alice had always been a good listener. When she was in school, she rarely spoke out of turn, but she always paid close attention to what everyone was saying. When the telephone company came to town looking for someone to run the switchboard, the town mayor suggested Alice. He said she had a clear, gentle-speaking voice and a responsible mind. Alice took the job and quickly found that she loved it. She loved being the invisible thread that held her community together. The telephone exchange was on the second floor of the brick building. It was a single square room. Against one wall stood the switchboard itself. It was a large, heavy piece of furniture made of polished dark wood. The front of the board was covered in a grid of small metal holes, which were called jacks. Below the holes was a flat shelf that held rows of brass plugs attached to long, thick cloth cords. There were also little metal switches and tiny glass bulbs that would light up when a call came in. Alice sat in a tall wooden chair in front of this board. She wore a heavy headset over her ears with a curved metal horn that sat right in front of her mouth. Her job was both simple and demanding. When someone in town turned the crank on their telephone, a small electrical current would travel down the wire to the exchange building. On Alice's board, a little metal door would drop open, and a light would flash above one of the holes. Alice would take a brass plug, push it into the hole, and flip a switch. She would say, "Operator, how can I help you?" The person on the line would ask to speak to the doctor, or the baker, or their sister. Alice would then take a second plug, push it into the hole for the person they wanted to reach, and pull a small lever to ring their telephone. Once the second person answered, Alice would close the connection, leaving the two neighbours to talk. During the day, the switchboard was a very busy place. The lights flashed constantly. Alice's hands moved quickly, plugging and unplugging cords, flipping switches and talking to the callers. She knew everyone's voice. She knew that Mr. Miller, the baker, always called the flour mill on Tuesday mornings. She knew that Mrs. Higgins called her daughter every afternoon at 3 o'clock to talk about her garden. She knew when babies were born because the whole town would call each other to share the happy news. Alice felt like the heartbeat of the town. She listened to their joys, their worries, and their daily routines. She was never allowed to listen to private conversations, and she strictly followed the rules. But just by connecting the lines, she felt deeply tied to every person in Green River. However, the job was very different at night. Alice worked the overnight shift, which started at 8 o'clock in the evening and ended at 6 o'clock in the morning. When the sun went down, the town of Green River went to sleep. The busy, flashing lights on the switchboard stopped. By 10 o'clock, the board was usually completely dark. The room would become perfectly quiet, except for the loud ticking of a large round clock on the wall. Alice was the only person in the building. To pass the time, she would bring a thermos of hot coffee, a basket of yarn, and a book to read. She would sit in her tall chair, knitting sweaters for the winter and reading stories, waiting for a light to flash. Most nights she did not get a single call between midnight and morning. But she had to stay awake and stay at her post, just in case there was an emergency. One evening in late autumn, Alice prepared for work as usual. The weather was growing cold. The trees had lost their leaves, and the wind blew sharply across the empty fields. The harvest was finished, and the town was exhausted from weeks of hard labour gathering the crops. Alice ate a quiet dinner with her parents. Her father fell asleep in his chair by the fire almost as soon as he finished eating. Her mother kissed Alice on the cheek, told her to stay warm, and handed her a wrapped slice of apple pie for her midnight snack. Alice put on her heavy wool coat, tied a scarf around her neck, and walked out into the chilly evening air. The walk to the exchange building took about 10 minutes. The dirt road was hard and frozen. The sky was clear, and a bright full moon was rising over the tops of the trees. The moonlight painted the town in pale silver colours. As she walked, Alice saw the familiar sights of her home. She walked past the bakery, where Mr. Miller was already cleaning his ovens for the next morning. She waved at him through the front window, and he waved back with a flower-covered hand. She walked past the doctor's house, noting that his carriage was parked outside, meaning no one was sick tonight. She saw lamps glowing warmly in the windows of the small wooden houses. Families were sitting by their fires, reading, talking, and getting ready for bed. Alice felt a deep sense of peace. This was her world. These were her people. She felt proud that she was the one who watched over them while they slept. Alice reached the brick building, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The room was warm, heated by a small coal stove in the corner. The day operator, a young woman named Mary, was just finishing her shift. Mary looked tired. She told Alice that it had been a very busy day. The train had brought in new farm equipment, and everyone had been calling the general store to ask about it. Mary packed up her things, wished Alice a good night, and left the building. Alice locked the door behind her. She took off her coat and scarf, hung them on a hook on the wall, and walked over to the switchboard. She sat down in her tall chair and put the heavy headset on. The metal band pressed familiar against her hair, and the speaking horn rested comfortably near her mouth. She arranged her knitting basket on the shelf beside her and poured a small cup of hot coffee from her thermos. The clock on the wall showed that it was just past 8 o'clock. A few late calls came in. Someone called to ask about the church meeting on Sunday. Another person called to say good night to their mother. Alice handled the calls smoothly, her hands moving over the brass plugs without even having to look. By 9 o'clock the calls slowed down. By 10 o'clock they stopped completely. Alice turned her chair slightly so she could look out the large window on the wall next to the switchboard. From her seat on the second floor she had a perfect view of Green River. The town was spread out below her like a map. She watched as the yellow lights in the windows of the houses went out, one by one. The general store went dark. The bakery went dark. Soon the entire town was swallowed by the shadows of the night. The only light came from the big bright moon, hanging in the clear black sky. The moonlight made the roofs of the houses shine and cast long dark shadows across the dirt roads. The silence of the night settled over the room. It was a heavy, thick silence. The hours began to pass. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Alice picked up her knitting needles and began to work on a red wool sweater. Her hands moved in a steady rhythm, matching the ticking of the clock. She felt calm and comfortable. She drank her coffee slowly to keep herself awake. Every so often she would glance up at the switchboard, checking to make sure it was dark. It always was. She looked out the window. Nothing moved in the town. There were no dogs barking, no horses walking down the street, no wind rattling the glass. The stillness was complete. It felt as though the entire world had stopped spinning and was resting. Midnight came and went. The clock hands slowly moved to 1 o'clock in the morning, and then to 2 o'clock. Alice ate her slice of apple pie. She read a few pages of her book, but she found her eyes wandering back to the window. She liked looking at the sleeping town. She looked at the roof of her own house, knowing her parents were asleep under their thick blankets. She looked at the house where her best friend, Sarah, lived with her husband and new baby. She felt a warm glow in her chest. She loved this town so much. She felt a protective bond over every sleeping soul out there. She was their silent guardian in the night, sitting in her warm room, keeping the lines open just in case they needed her. As the clock hands moved closer to 3 o'clock in the morning, the atmosphere in the room began to change. Alice stopped knitting. She did not know why, but a strange feeling washed over her. The air in the room suddenly felt very cold. The fire in the coal stove was still burning brightly, but a deep, icy chill crept up her legs and arms. She shivered and reached for her sweater. The air also felt heavy, as if a thick blanket had been thrown over the room. The ticking of the clock seemed to slow down, the sound becoming dull and distant. Alice felt a sudden, sharp sense of unease. It was a feeling she had never experienced in this room before. She felt as though someone or something was standing right behind her chair. She spun around, her heart beating a little faster, but the room was completely empty. The shadows in the corners were quiet and still. She turned back to the switchboard. She told herself she was just tired. It was the middle of the night, and her mind was playing tricks on her. She took a deep breath and tried to calm down. She looked at the clock. It was 2:58 in the morning. 2 more minutes until 3 o'clock. She stared at the big, round face of the clock, watching the long hand move slowly toward the 12. The heavy feeling in the air grew stronger. It felt like the pressure in the air right before a terrible thunderstorm. Alice rubbed her arms to warm them up. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It felt tense. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. The clock hand finally clicked onto the 12. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. At that exact second, a loud, sharp clicking noise came from the switchboard. Alice jumped in her chair. A metal door had dropped open and a bright red light had flashed on. Alice stared at the light. Her heart hammered in her chest. A call at 3 in the morning was incredibly rare. Her mind immediately raced with worry. Was someone hurt? Was there a fire? She quickly leaned forward, her hands hovering over the brass plugs. But as she looked closer at the board, her confusion replaced her worry. The red light was not flashing over a hole that belonged to a house. It was not the doctor's line. It was not the farm line. The light was flashing on the very bottom row of the switchboard. This row was completely different from the rest. When the telephone company built the board, they added a row of blank holes. These holes did not have any wires connected to them in the back of the machine. They were put there just in case the town grew larger in the future and they needed to add more telephones. They were dead circuits. They led to nothing. It was physically impossible for a call to come through a blank plug. There was no wire out there to send the electrical current. Yet the red light was glowing brightly, steadily, right above the third blank hole from the left. Alice sat frozen for a moment. Her mind could not make sense of what her eyes were seeing. She knew how the machine worked. She knew every wire and every connection. The light should not be on. She thought it must be a broken part inside the cabinet. Maybe a wire from another row had fallen down and touched the blank row. That had to be it. It was just a mechanical mistake. She waited for a moment, expecting the light to flicker and go out. But it did not. It stayed bright red, cutting through the dim light of the room. Her training told her she had to answer every light. Even if it was a mistake, she had to follow the rules. Her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up a heavy brass plug attached to a long cloth cord. The metal plug felt unusually cold against her skin, like a piece of ice. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She reached out and pushed the brass plug firmly into the blank hole. She heard the familiar click as it locked into place. She reached down and flipped the metal switch to open the listening line. She leaned forward, speaking clearly into the metal horn. "Operator," she said, her voice sounding small and nervous in the quiet room. "How can I help you?" She expected to hear nothing but static or the dead silence of an empty wire. Instead, a sound exploded into her headset. It was a wall of noise so loud and violent that Alice physically threw her hands up to her ears, crying out in shock. But she could not escape the sound, because the headset was clamped tight over her head. The noise poured directly into her ears, filling her mind with an overwhelming flood of sheer terror. It was screaming. It was not one person screaming. It was thousands of people screaming all at exactly the same time. The sound was deafening, a chaotic storm of raw, pure agony. It was the sound of ultimate pain, of absolute terror, of souls being ripped apart. Alice squeezed her eyes shut, tears springing to her lashes. Her hands clawed at the desk, trying to find the strength to pull the plug out, but her body was frozen. Her muscles would not obey her brain. She was trapped, locked into the chair by the sheer force of the horror pouring into her ears. As the seconds dragged on, her brain began to adjust to the wall of noise. The giant wave of sound began to separate into individual voices. And that was when the true nightmare began. She knew the voices. She heard Mr. Miller, the kind baker who always gave her extra bread. He was shrieking, a high, ragged sound, begging for mercy from something she could not see. She heard Sarah, her best friend, crying out in a voice filled with an unbearable, hopeless panic, screaming for her baby. She heard the deep, strong voice of the town doctor, reduced to animal-like howls of pain. She heard the children from the schoolhouse, their small voices wailing in chorus, a sound that tore at Alice's heart like a knife. And then she heard them. She heard her mother and her father. Her father was roaring in agony, a sound she had never thought a man could make. Her mother was sobbing and screaming Alice's name over and over again, her voice cracking with pain and terror. "Alice! Alice! Help us! Please, Alice, it hurts!" Alice sobbed out loud in the empty room. "Mama!" she cried back into the metal horn. "Mama, what is it? Where are you?" But her mother did not answer her. The screaming just continued, an endless, looping chorus of torture. Every person she had ever known, every person she loved, every soul in Green River was screaming through the wire. The sheer volume of their pain was impossible to comprehend. It sounded as though the entire town was being burned alive in a giant pit of fire. Driven by panic, Alice snapped her eyes open. She threw her head toward the large glass window. She expected to see the sky glowing orange with flames. She expected to see the town destroyed, buildings collapsing, people running, screaming into the streets. She expected to see the end of the world. But she saw nothing. The town of Green River looked exactly as it had 10 minutes ago. It was perfectly still. The moonlight shone peacefully on the rooftops. The streets were empty and quiet. No smoke rose into the air. No lights were turned on in the houses. Her parents' house stood quietly in the distance, its white paint glowing softly in the silver light. Everything was totally calm. Everyone was still fast asleep in their beds. Alice stared out of the window, her mind breaking under the weight of what she was experiencing. Her eyes showed her a quiet, sleeping town, safe and peaceful. But her ears were filled with the agonizing, dying screams of every person living in those quiet houses. The disconnect between what she saw and what she heard was impossible. It felt like the world had split open and she was falling into a dark, bottomless hole. She could not understand it. How could they be sleeping while their voices screamed in her ears? Where was the sound coming from? She tried again to raise her hand, to grab the thick cloth cord and rip the brass plug out of the board. She wanted to break the connection. She wanted to stop the terrible noise. But her body felt incredibly heavy, as if she were trapped under a mountain of stones. The cold air in the room had grown even colder, turning her breath into white clouds of vapour. Then the screaming began to change. The voices of her family and friends did not stop, but they seemed to fade slightly into the background, becoming a low, continuous wail of despair. Through the chaos of the screams, A new sound came through the wire. It was a voice, but it was not a human voice. It was not a sound that belonged on this earth. It was impossibly deep, vibrating with a cold, heavy power that shook Alice's teeth inside her head. The voice did not sound angry, or happy, or sad. It sounded completely empty. It sounded like the dark, freezing spaces between the stars. It sounded like the vast, endless blackness of the night sky, given a voice. When the voice spoke, the words did not just come through the headset. They seemed to echo directly inside Alice's mind, filling her whole head with a heavy, booming pressure. "Thank you, Alice," the cold voice said. Alice stopped breathing. The tears on her cheeks turned cold. Her heart felt as though it had completely stopped beating. The voice knew her name. It was speaking directly to her. "Thank you for opening the door," the vast, booming voice continued, speaking slowly, taking its time. "The circuit is now complete." In that exact moment, a terrible, crystal-clear understanding crashed into Alice's mind. She did not know how she knew, but she knew the absolute truth of what was happening. She understood what she had done. The thing on the other end of the line was not a person. It was not a caller. It was a predator. It was an ancient, starving thing that lived in the dark, unseen corners of the universe. It was a cosmic shadow that fed on the minds, the memories, and the spiritual energy of living things. It was a silent, creeping terror that floated through the endless void, looking for a way in. But it had a weakness. It could not just drop down from the sky and take what it wanted. The minds of sleeping humans were locked away inside their bodies. The predator could not touch them. It existed on a different layer of reality. It needed a bridge. It needed a physical connection to tie its dark world to the waking world of the earth. It needed a wire to travel down. The telephone lines were made of copper and wood, stretching from house to house, connecting every sleeping mind in the town of Green River into one giant web. But the web had a gatekeeper. All the lines came to this one brick building, to this one wooden cabinet. The blank holes on the switchboard were the only open doors, the only places where the outside void pressed against the wires. The predator had reached out, lighting the red bulb, knocking on the door. It could not open the door itself. It needed a human being to physically bridge the gap. It needed someone to take a piece of metal, connect it to the sleeping town, and open the circuit. And Alice had done it. She was the operator. She was the one who connected people. It was her job. When the light flashed, she had taken the brass plug and pushed it into the hole. She had flipped the switch. In doing so, she had unwittingly tied the collective minds of her entire town directly into the mouth of a cosmic nightmare. She had opened the door and invited the predator inside. The screams in her ears grew slightly louder again. She realized they were not physical screams. The people out there in the dark houses were not burning in a real fire. They were sleeping. Their bodies were still resting safely in their beds, but their minds, their souls, their inner selves were being ripped out of them through the copper wires, pulled down the lines to the switchboard, and fed straight into the dark void that waited on the other end of the blank plug. The predator was consuming them, eating their memories, their loves, their fears, and their lives. The screams were the sounds of their spiritual destruction. "The feast is rich," the deep, booming voice echoed in her mind, sending a wave of absolute freezing dread down her spine. "They are delicious." A wave of nausea hit Alice so hard she almost threw up. The guilt was a physical crushing weight on her chest. She had killed them. She had killed her mother. She had killed her father. She had killed Mr. Miller and the doctor and little baby Sarah. She had taken everyone she loved and handed them over to a monster from the stars. "No," Alice whispered, her voice a tiny broken squeak against the massive weight of the alien voice. "No, please, let them go. Please." "They are already gone," the voice replied. The words were flat and cold, carrying no emotion at all. It was simply stating a fact. Alice stared desperately at her right hand. It was resting on the flat wooden shelf of the switchboard, just inches away from the brass plug. All she had to do was lift her hand, close her fingers around the metal, and pull it out. If she pulled the plug, she would break the circuit. She would close the door. She tried with every ounce of willpower she had to move her fingers. She screamed inside her own mind, commanding her arm to move. But her body was completely paralyzed. The fear had locked her muscles into stone. Or perhaps it was the creature on the other end of the line, using its massive mental weight to pin her down. She could not move a single inch. She could not blink. She could not turn her head. She was trapped in the chair, a prisoner in her own body. She was forced to sit there, staring straight ahead out the large glass window. The moon continued its slow journey across the black sky, shining its cold silver light down on the town of Green River. The houses looked so peaceful. It was a beautiful, quiet night. But inside Alice's headset, the nightmare raged on. She sat perfectly still, frozen in the dim light of the small room, the ticking of the wall clock entirely drowned out by the noise. She listened to the endless, agonizing screams of her townspeople. She heard her mother's voice slowly fade away into a ragged sob, and then go quiet. She heard her father's roars turn into a dying gasp. One by one, the voices she knew so well were snuffed out, consumed by the dark, hungry void. She could not move. She could not look away. She could only sit there, drowning in an ocean of impossible guilt, as the cold, booming voice continued to whisper its terrible thanks into her ear. She was the operator. She had made the connection. And now she had to listen to the end of her world, while the rest of the universe slept on in total silence.